If you've reached this point, you've already noticed that something in you has changed, and there's no turning back. You're still living the same life, but he no longer feels the same way. That which once held you back no longer holds. That which once affected you, it no longer reaches, and that didn't make you lighter right away. On the contrary, it made you more distant, as if you were looking at everything from the outside, as if, for the first time, you were no longer inside the chaos. And the hardest thing was not to change. He realized that you can't go back to who you were, because something inside you just stopped accepting. He stopped insisting, he stopped explaining himself, it stopped wearing out. And that didn't happen because you decided to be stronger, it happened because you got tired. On a level that has no name, a tiredness that is not physical, nor emotional, it is deeper. It is as if his own soul had said, "So far." And from that point on, you have not become colder, you have become more whole. Carl Jung spoke of this moment as a necessary rupture, a point where the old identity no longer sustains the consciousness that was born. And that's exactly it. That the empath enters something rare, not visible, not explained, but sense, the Sophia stage. And what almost no one tells you is that when you get here, you don't become more expressive, you become quieter. But it is not a silence of absence, it is a silence that observes, which comprises, and that he no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. Because now, what you carry inside no longer needs to be validated outside. Under the invisible weight of feeling too much, there is something that almost no one can explain. But you always did. From a very early age, you realized that you were not like the others. Not because I wanted to be different, but because it simply was. While the others went through the situations, you absorbed. While the others forgot, you carried. And that wasn't a choice, it was automatic. You entered an environment and already felt what was not said. I perceived hidden tensions. It captured emotions that didn't even belong to you. And without realizing it, he began to live a life that was not entirely his own. Because feeling too much does not come with manual. Nobody teaches you to separate what is yours, then you have merely grasped. So you started doing what seemed natural. You tried to balance everything. He tried to lighten the burden of others. He tried to harmonize the environment. He tried to keep the peace, even when it meant swallowing oneself. And in the beginning, that seemed like strength. It seemed sensitive. It looked like something beautiful. But over time, it started to cost dearly. Because every time you ignored what you felt to sustain what others needed, a piece of him was left behind. And you didn't even notice. I only felt the fatigue increasing, a strange tiredness, because it didn't come from physical exertion, nor of excessive tasks. It came from something deeper, to be constantly open, without ever closing itself, to always be available, without ever really being seen. And little by little, something began to change. You still felt everything. But he could no longer sustain himself as before, that which you once endured in silence. It started to bother him. What you used to accept began to weigh down. And it was at this point that the first rupture happened. Not external, internal, a slight displacement. Almost imperceptible, but definitive. You started to realize that feeling too much wasn't the problem. The problem, it was to continue ignoring oneself. And this perception changes everything. Because from there, you can't go back to being someone you didn't see yourself, even if you try, even if you want to. Something inside you has already awakened. And once that happens, the way back ceases to exist. The fatigue of being, everyone's refuge for a long time. You were the place where others rested, the place where they vented, the place where they found understanding. You were the one listening, when no one else wanted to listen. Who was, when everyone left, who understood, even without explanation. And it has created a silent identity within you, the identity of those who sustain, of those who welcome, of those who solve without being seen. But there is a detail that no one talks about. The refuge, it is never anyone's final destination. People pass by it, they are relieved, and they continue. And you stay, with what was left, with the emotions that were not his, with the weights that no one took back. And in the beginning, you accepted that, because he believed that this was his role, that this was his value, be necessary, be important, and to be the one who is always available. But over time, this begins to create a void that is difficult to explain, because you notice something uncomfortable. You are present in everyone's life, but no one is truly present in yours. You know others deeply, but almost no one really knows you. And even when he tries to show off, it seems that they can't find you. They find only the role you have always played. And that's where the fatigue begins. Not physical fatigue, but an existential exhaustion. To always be the support, and never be sustained. To always be the strong, and can never simply be. And little by little, something inside you begins to refuse, not aggressively, but silent. You start to move away, without explaining, start answering less, without justification, and he starts not to offer himself as before. And that confuses people, because they were used to a version of you which no longer exists. But for you, it is not a decision. It is a limit that has arisen, natural, inevitable, as if something inside you said, enough. And that enough, it is not against others. It's in favor of you. It is the beginning of something rare. Because from that point on, you stop being the place where everyone rests, and it begins, for the first time, to come back to you. And this, it is the beginning of the transformation that has no return. The moment when something inside him refuses to continue. There is a point where you realize you can't do it anymore. It's not that you don't want to. It's not that you've decided to change. It is deeper than that. It's as if something inside you simply turn it off. That which you once tolerated, it no longer passes. What you used to justify no longer finds an explanation. And the strangest thing, it's just that this is not accompanied by anger, nor of revolt. It comes with clarity, a quiet clarity, that does not ask permission to exist. You start to see patterns. He begins to perceive cycles that were repeating themselves, dynamics that consumed you, situations where you always gave more and received less than he needed. And for the first time, you don't try to fix it. You don't try to save. You don't try to sustain it. You just observe. And that changes everything. Because it empathizes him by nature, age. He feels and moves. He perceives and interferes. He captures and tries to balance. But now, and something inside him no longer responds in the same way. There is no impulse to fix. There is no urgency to solve it. There is just a different presence, quieter, firmer, more distant. And this distance, it's not coldness, it's lucidity. It's the realization that continuing to do the same, it would be to continue abandoning oneself. And this, it is no longer possible. Not after everything you realized, not after everything you felt, and finally understood. And it is at this moment that something ends. No ad, no explanation. You stop insisting where there is no longer reciprocity. Stop remaining where there is no longer truth. Stop molding yourself where there is no longer room for who you are. And that scares us, not only the others, but so do you. Because for the first time, you're not reacting, and you are choosing, even if in silence, even if you don't know exactly where it will take you. And this choice, it's the beginning of the separation between who you were and who you are becoming. The silent death of old identity. Few talk about it, but every real transformation, it demands a loss, not an external loss, but internal, the loss of who you believed yourself to be. For a long time, you have built your identity around feeling, of caring, of being present, of being necessary, and that shaped their choices, your relationships, their way of existing in the world. But there comes a point in which this identity begins to no longer fit, not because I was wrong, but because you became small for who you have become. And that's where something uncomfortable begins. A slow process. Silent, and often lonely. You start to recognize yourself less. Things that used to make sense, they no longer do. Places that were once familiar, they no longer welcome it. People who were once important, they no longer connect in the same way. And that creates a void, a strange space between who you were and who you still can't define. And this space, it is necessary, but it is not easy. Because in it, you have no references, he has no clear identity. There are no ready-made answers. You just feel that something old is dying. And this death is not dramatic. It is silent, gradual, almost imperceptible to outsiders, but completely real for those inside. You stop reacting as before, stop getting involved as before, stop giving yourself away as before. And not because he decided to be different, but because it simply cannot be the same anymore. And this can generate guilt, it can generate doubt, it can generate the feeling that you are moving too far away, or even becoming someone unrecognizable. But actually, you are becoming someone true. Because this death, it is not an end, it is a liberation. The release of a version of your that was necessary at a time, but that no longer sustains who you are now. And when that old identity dissolves, something begins to emerge, still without form, still unnamed, but with a different presence, more stable, more whole, quieter. And that's exactly it, that the empath begins to enter a territory that few reach, a place where he is no longer defined by what he feels for others, but for what he finally recognizes in himself. And there is no turning back from here, the integration of the shadow and the end of the internal struggle for a long time. You believed you needed to be light, be understanding, be patient, being someone who always chooses the good, even when it hurts. And, in a way, that defined you. But what no one explained to you, it's just that while you were trying to be just light, a part of you was left behind, a part that felt angry, that he was tired, that I wanted to say no. But he said yes, a part that knew, but it was ignored, and that part, it never disappeared. She just fell silent, observing, waiting, until the time came in which you could no longer ignore it, not because he wanted to access it, but because she started to show herself, within its limits, in his exhaustion, in its inability to always remain the same. And for the first time, you didn't reject that. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't try to soften it. You just noticed. Have you noticed that inside you, there was more than what you ever showed, and that didn't make you worse. It made you whole. Carl Jung talked about this as the integration of the shadow, not as something negative, but as a return. The return of parts of you that were denied so that you could be accepted. And when that integration begins, the internal struggle subsides. You no longer have to force yourself to always be understanding. You no longer need to justify everything. It no longer needs to adapt to fit. Because now, you recognize your own limits, and he respects it. No guilt, no need to explain. And it completely changes the way you exist. You don't react the same way anymore. He does not get involved in the same way. He does not surrender with the same excessive intensity, but not because it closed, but because he found himself. And when that happens, something very rare arises. A quiet balance. Where do you still feel, but it is not lost? Still understand, but it does not absorb everything. It still understands, but it does not abandon itself. And this state, it is the beginning of a force that does not need to be demonstrated, because it does not come from the reaction. It comes from integration, the birth of a presence that doesn't need to be seen. After all this, something changes definitively, but not in the way people expect. You don't become more expansive. It doesn't become more expressive. He feels no need to show who he has become. In fact, you become quieter, but it's a different silence. It is not empty. It is not absence. It is presence. A presence that does not try to occupy space, but that naturally transforms the environment. You enter a place, and you no longer need to observe everything to understand. You just notice. Effortlessly, no tension, and the most curious is that you no longer feel the need to act on it. Before you would feel it and try to adjust. I would try to balance. I would try to solve it. Now, you just are. And that, in itself, it already changes everything around you. because there is a profound difference between those who try to influence and those who naturally influence without trying. And you started living right in that place, a place where your presence speaks, even when you don't say anything, where your energy stands without having to impose himself, where your silence communicates without having to explain. And that can confuse people because they were used to a version of you, more accessible, more available, more predictable. Now, they can't read you in the same way. They can't access you like they used to. And it's not because you've closed yourself off, it's because you stopped exposing yourself unnecessarily. You no longer feel the need to be understood by everyone, nor to be accepted by any environment. You just recognize where you belong, and where it no longer belongs. And this creates an invisible change, but extremely strong, because now, and you no longer move out of need, nor because of the need for validation. You move by alignment. And when there is no alignment, you just don't move. No conflict, no explanation, and this way of existing is rare, because it requires something that few achieve: being in yourself without needing to be seen to feel real. And when you get to that point, you're no longer trying to become something. You have already become, even if no one notices, even if no one understands. Because this transformation, it was not made to be shown. It was made to be lived. And from here, the empath is no longer at the same level of consciousness as before. He entered something deeper, quieter, more definitive. And there is no turning back. The silence that doesn't ask, doesn't explain, and yet transforms everything. There is something you notice, but perhaps he never managed to appoint it. You no longer feel the need to react. He no longer feels the need to correct, nor to convince, nor to explain who you are. And this, it didn't come from an effort. It came from an end. The end of that part of you that still needed to be understood. For a long time, you believed that if you explained it better, if it showed more, if it were clearer, people would finally understand you, but they didn't understand. And at some point, that no longer matters. Not out of frustration, but for liberation, because you realized something profound. Who needs constant explanation? He still doesn't really see you, and who sees, it doesn't need you to say anything. And this is where silence changes its nature. It is no longer a reaction. It is not a withdrawal. It is not defense. It's choice. A quiet choice of not wearing out where there is no real connection, of not exposing oneself where there is no true space, not to speak when silence says it all. And that kind of silence, it is not empty. It is dense, loaded with presence, loaded with consciousness, loaded with something that doesn't need external validation. You observe more, talk less, but understands much more, and the most curious. It's just that, even without trying, you start impacting everything around you. People notice that you have changed. Environments react differently to your presence. Some approach without knowing why. Others move away without being able to explain. And this happens because you have stopped vibrating at the same frequency as before. You don't get into emotional games anymore. Don't get involved in dynamics that used to consume you. It does not respond as before. And this, it destructures patterns, but not because you're trying to change the world, it's because you've stopped adapting to it. And that's the real strength of this stage. You're no longer trying to transform anyone, but still, everything around you begins to change, because now, you no longer offer the same energy that sustained certain dynamics. You no longer feed what drained you, and without that food, many things simply cease to exist. No conflict, no confrontation, just they are no longer part of their reality. And that's why this stage is so rare, because he's not noisy. It is not visible to outsiders, but it is absolutely transformative for those who live. Carl Jung saw this moment as the final integration of something essential, a state where the individual no longer depends on external approval, because he has found something internal that sustains his own existence. And this cannot be taught. It cannot be forced. It can only be lived. And when you get here, there is no more urgency. There is no more desperate searching. There is no need to prove anything anymore. You just exist, whole, present, silent, and for the first time, at peace with himself, because now, you're no longer trying to be who others need you to be. You've finally become who he always was.